Governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, said that she requested the expulsion of China's consul general in New York and had spoken to the Secretary of State about that. Can you confirm that that's happened?
So I saw the governor's statement. She actually spoke to the Deputy Secretary of State earlier today. So first of all, the consul general was not expelled. Our understanding is that the consul general reached the end of a regular scheduled rotation in August, and so rotated out of the position, but was not expelled. But of course, when it comes to the status of particular employees of a foreign mission, I would refer you to the foreign country, but there was no expulsion action. Okay, and I'm presuming this is related to someone in her office who was working for the Chinese government. There's been law enforcement action on that, but is that, you say the consul wasn't expelled, but is there a sort of grounds for expulsion, or is that something that the department has considered? So I'm not going to speak to anything that we might have considered, or especially when it comes to an action that wasn't taken. In this case, this particular individual was not expelled, just reached the end of a regular scheduled rotation. That said, foreign interference, including attempts to influence through covert activities that should be registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act and are not registered are things that we take very seriously, as you saw by the action the Department of Justice took yesterday. Do you know when that happened, when he left? It was the end of August, my understanding.
That was from the U.S. Department of State's daily press briefing on September 4th, 2024. After the decision by New York prosecutors to charge a former aide to the New York governor with acting as an illegal agent for the Chinese government raised concerns about China's efforts to influence U.S. politics. But just a week prior to the prosecutor's decision, Chinese leader Xi Jinping made a plea for less fractious U.S.-China ties in a meeting with National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan, according to a statement from Beijing. When you type in U.S.China on Google search engine, the first few things that came up include U.S.China trade war, U.S.China relations, U.S.China war, U.S.China tariff, U.S.China tensions, and U.S.China decoupling. And it doesn't take an international relations expert to see that the tensions between the two countries have risen in the past few years, which seemed to go against the past belief that capitalism or free market economy would lead to democracy, or at least something very closely tied to democracy. Here's Australian Strategic Policy Institute's head of China investigation and analysis, Bethany Allen, explaining this phenomenon.
And then stayed at 8% for a while, really a miracle, China's economic miracle. And there was a lot of optimism at that time. There was this belief, especially strong in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, that capitalism, that free market capitalism wouldn't just lead to democracy, but that it in fact itself was democracy, or was very, very closely tied to democracy. And so there was a huge amount of optimism, seeing that China's economy was gradually moving more and more towards a market-based model and away from a state-controlled model.
But sadly, China didn't become a democracy. Instead, it doubles down on its authoritarian control. You're listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu. Today we're joined by Mr. Orville Schell, Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations at Asia Society in New York. He is a former professor and dean at the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Mr. Schell is one of the most known American sinologists in the world, and he's here to help us find out why China hasn't become a democracy to this day.
It's a very interesting question as to why China really not only gave up, but I think destroyed what we in the United States called engagement. Because it was actually very much in the interest of China, in the interest of the U.S., in the interest of Taiwan and the world, But strangely, when you think about it, we in English had the word engagement, which meant more than just trading.
In the 1500s, the word to engage is to deposit or to pledge, to offer one's life or honor as a guarantee. And figuratively, it also means to expose to risk, willing to compromise. And since then, the word engage means to bind or secure two parties or more by a pledge.
It meant that slowly, as we came closer together economically, we would also draw together in other ways and become less adversarial and less in conflict. And so that was the hope, that markets, open markets, free markets, more trade would also lead to more cultural exchange, more academic exchange, media exchange, and that in turn would slowly allow China to evolve out of its old Maoist revolutionary phase into something else. Nobody was quite sure what. But in China, there was no word for engagement. You can say 接触, but it didn't come with all of the meaning that engagement did, which engagement implied that there was a historical motion, and that if we kept just interacting, we would converge. Not completely, but we would become less antagonistic. That didn't happen. And particularly under Xi Jinping, he didn't begin the process of ending engagement, but he certainly made it clear that was not where he wanted to go, because I think he saw it as a color revolution, and he saw it as what the Chinese Communist Party calls 和平演变, peaceful evolution, which means slowly the party will be evolved out of power. So this was it was in a certain sense a failure, but in my view, it was still worth trying, because Mao's revolution was so brutal, so disruptive, and so savage that anything a country like the United States, which likes to think of itself as a leader, could do to help embrace China and slowly help it change and evolve, I think was leadership. It was good, but it failed. And now we're in the situation where we don't really have a new policy, except we call it competition. And of course, the leadership in Beijing doesn't like that word, because it suggests, we're not win-win, we're not hao pengyao, or this, that, and the other. But I think the bitter reality is that we're in a very new period of history, and we're trying to find our way. What's the best way to sort of protect ourselves, our markets, our allies, our friends, our supply chains, and without conflict.
Despite the fact that China often uses trade as a tool to achieve non-trade objectives, mostly political and related to its human rights violations, many still believe that trade and engagement are good for human rights. The United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner says, international trade can be a means to increasing the resources available to states for advancing human rights. But what it doesn't say is that some countries have no intention of advancing its human rights. But here's Dr. Schell, who offers me some kind of appropriate resolution. He tells me the difference between trying and failing to try.
I think it was worth trying, because while I think many of us understood it would be very hard to change a one-party Leninist system, there were moments when it looked like it was possible, particularly in the 1980s. And 1990s. Sadly, the 1989 demonstrations and the Beijing massacre really stopped a process of reform. Now, whether it would have succeeded in going forward if the June 4th had not happened, it's hard to say. But I was there much of the time in the late 1980s, and Zhao Ziyang was a decent man. He was a communist, but he was also, I think, at heart, a humanist, and understood there were more important things than just control. But he got purged. So it's hard to say. I do think it was worth a try. And as I look back on it, my own judgment is it's very, very difficult to change a one-party Leninist system. And yet, I have to say, I came to Taiwan in 1961 as a student. Taiwan had a one-party system. Taiwan had a big leader, Jiang Jieshi. Taiwan had martial law. It didn't have a Maoist revolution, but it still was, the Kuomintang was built with the help of the Soviet Union. And yet, it changed. Korea changed. So it's not unthinkable. But for a country that is a very deeply rooted communist party and structure, borrowed all of its institutions from Russia under Stalin, as I look back, I have to acknowledge it was a difficult task, and it did fail.
I always believe that to topple a dictator or an authoritarian regime, you need movements, social and political.
I think it was it's certainly generated in many ways by grassroots influences. There were big demonstrations in Korea against, the Syngman Rhee and the later, and in Taiwan certainly as the Dangwai began to develop, that was from the bottom up. But if you don't have the top at some point letting go, you will have bloodshed. You will have a counter-revolution. And then that destabilizes everything. So even though the Chinese Communist Party hates the idea of peaceful evolution, that's the best hope. And Taiwan managed to have peaceful evolution. And there are many problems, there are many faults, there are many things that still need to be perhaps worked out, but I think Taiwan needs to consider itself very lucky that it made the transition in a peaceful way.
Many in Taiwan might disagree with Dr. Schell's interpretation of Taiwan's evolution to a democracy. I'm more eager to find out whether either top-down political change or grassroots movements to overthrow authoritarianism could be replicated in modern China.
It's very hard to tell. I think it will be a combination. When I first went to China in 1975, the Cultural Revolution hadn't ended. And I was very glad in retrospect to see it, experience it, and see what it was like. But at that time, I could not imagine China changing. There was no bit of evidence to suggest that within the China of the 1970s, there was the ability to, fanshen, to turn itself over. And yet, Mao died. Deng Xiaoping came back to power. He launched his Gaiga Kaifang, his opening and reform movement, and the rest of it. So it's simply to say we never know in a country like China what will happen. But what we do know is that there are deep wells, deep springs of competing forces of democracy, of authoritarianism, of modernization, traditionalism, openness, closeness underneath the surface that spring up. And they've been doing that ever since the May 4th movement in 1919. Many times. And they will again. When? It's hard to say. And it's even harder to say what the outcome will be.
If and when that happens, will there be any international media left in the country to tell their story? After all, it is a country that weaponizes visa to pressure foreign journalists operating in the country. In 1969, Mr. Schell co-founded Pacific News Service to create and distribute news and commentary from a broader spectrum of voices, especially viewpoints from abroad. And he served as China correspondent for numerous news outlets since the 1970s.
Well, different periods have different atmospheres. The 70s was closed until Deng Xiaoping came. The 80s was very open. Then it closed for a few years. It was very tight. Then it opened, and then it closed again on Hu Jintao and now Xi Jinping. So this is a sort of an oscillating pulse that changes, and of course history always is moving forward. So it's a little hard to know exactly what the next phase will be, but I always describe China as one of the least resolved great powers and societies in the world. And what I mean by that is that it still doesn't know what its basic foundation should be or could be. It's sort of caught in the middle. And the game isn't over yet. Now, I think in a certain sense, you could say for Taiwan, the chances of going back to authoritarianism are not great. Although who knows? We look at the United States with Trump. So politics is very hard to predict, and nothing is very certain. We can't see the future, but we can see the past, and we can see what forces have been at work throughout history, and they don't disappear. They just go underground for a while and then reappear later. I think any journalist, whether it's foreign or Chinese, in China, is dancing on the edge of a razor blade all the time. And that is because now the party has come to view any kind of investigative journalism, interviewing people as a form of espionage, of spying. So it turns the act of trying to do what we consider normal journalism, or even for companies to do due diligence about whether an investment is worthy, what's the background, is the company able or whatever. If that is all considered a kind of subversion and intelligence gathering, then we're in a place where foreigners have a very difficult time conducting any kind of businesses or media operations within China.
Thank you for listening. This episode of The Divide is produced by Radio Taiwan International.